Hello and welcome to this month's Rights in Russia interview. It's May 29th, 2025, and our guest today is Anna Bowles. Anna holds an MA in Russian Studies from the School of Slavonic and Eastern European Studies in London and works as a freelance editor for publishing houses in central London. She's also a pro-Ukrainian activist, and since Russia's full-scale invasion, she's spent a great deal of time in that country writing about the invasion and the effect on local people of Russian violence. Anna returned to London from her latest trip in May 2025, just this month, and we're delighted to speak with her about her life and work in Ukraine. Welcome to Rights in Russia, Anna.
Thanks for inviting me to speak.
We spoke to you last in April 2023, almost 2 years ago. What have you been doing since then?
Well, as you would expect from the whole vibe of my blog and the interview, I have been in Ukraine quite a lot. And I've been doing a number of things over there. I've it's developed, I suppose. To start with, the last time I spoke to you, I had gone over for just 3 weeks to help a group of my friends called the Freefilmers, who sound like they're a film company, but they aren't actually. They used to be a filming network before the war, but have now become humanitarians. And I helped get them some grant money and raise awareness, and then take humanitarian aid to some deoccupied villages. And that was just 3 weeks. But I found after that I wanted to keep helping as much as possible. And of course, I do have a background of knowledge of Russia, and I was gaining knowledge of Ukraine through closely associating with people there and being there. So I wanted to continue to use that in a positive way. And I went back on my own in August 2023 and started trying to volunteer with other organisations, including Western ones. And I also wrote about it, as I'm a professional writer and editor. And after a while, I found that the writing about it was becoming as important as the hands-on volunteering, because I started a Substack almost 18 months ago now. And Substack is a great place for actual serious writing. I would recommend it to anyone who is interested in any subject, because so many of social media spaces these days are just overrun with rubbish, if not actual toxic propaganda. Whereas Substack is a place where you can just type in a search function and you will find a useful blog about that topic that we all want to read. So I started blogging there, and then quite quickly I started getting more and more subscribers. And a lot of them are people who, with a very serious interest in Ukraine, analysts, journalists, political advisors, kind of people who want to know what's going on the ground in more detail than they can get in the media. Obviously, there is some good media coverage, but it can only go into a certain degree of depth. So I realised that while it's also important to shift boxes in warehouses and deliver things to people in villages, was probably being even more useful by finding other people who did this and writing about them in an in-depth way without needing to talk things up the way the media sometimes has to in order to make sales. So gradually, in the course of 4 visits of 2 or 3 months each, I've become a kind of roving unpaid journalist slash contacts broker. That isn't really a name for what I've ended up doing, and I think I'm the only person doing it. But I do feel like I'm filling a niche, because there are so many little organizations over there, especially Ukrainian run, doing wonderful things, but who don't have time to promote themselves or connect with each other. And quite often they are in desperate need of outside help, particularly if they're Ukrainians operating in the East, which is where I mainly go to. So my recent aim has been to try and find these organisations and connect them up with the outside world, in part by writing about them, but also by contacting specific people who I now know.
And can you give us a sense of the situation in Ukraine more generally at the present time? I mean, how has it changed over the past 2 years? And if so, how?
Well, everybody used to be fired up. I wouldn't quite say enthusiastic, but they were determined to do what had to be done. And now they're still determined to do what has to be done, but in a sort of grim, hanging on sort of way. Everybody used to talk about what they would do after the victory, for example. And this time I saw an advert for victory over acid reflux. But other than that, the word victory didn't really turn up. So people are just focusing on getting through the next day. And of course, America's reputation is now in the toilet in Ukraine, which it will not surprise you to hear. They have just concluded that nothing can be expected from America, and they are hoping that Europe will continue to support them enough for them to continue fighting. There isn't much expectation of the Ukrainian army breaking through the Russian lines and retaking huge amounts of territory at this point, but nor is there much appetite for ceding that territory. So it's a case of who will last longest, essentially, whether the Russians will fight longer than the Ukrainians can resist. And I personally feel that the entire world needs to try and survive the next 4 years of the Trump administration. And if the world is still there after that, we'll be doing quite well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Ukraine may have to fight for 4 years until he's out of the way, which is an appalling prospect, but people recognize that there's no choice.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Is current public opinion about the war, does it continue to be positive? I mean, what's your sense of that?
It does depend a bit on what part of the country you're in. People who are in the western cities are able to block it out a bit at this point. If you're in a city in the east where you can hear the front line all the time, obviously you can't. And there is certainly a lot of exhaustion. You do sometimes talk to people who say, well, maybe we should, if not surrender, then at least make an unfavorable compromise. For example, one guy said, look, I live on the 7th floor and I'm fed up with seeing rockets fly past my window. So anything that would make that stop, he might consider.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, when people think more deeply, they do remember that actually being occupied by Russia means that they come and drag your children off to torture chambers, and that actually it is worth fighting that off in any way that they possibly can. So there is superficial opinion and a more deep-rooted opinion, and sometimes the deep-rooted opinion sustains people's resistance, even if on a more superficial level they start to feel ambivalent.
Mm-hmm. You've continued to publish your excellent pieces on Substack, and could you tell us something about your writing more generally?
Substack is my main focus of writing at the moment because I feel like I'm doing something useful. But I've also been writing poetry about my experiences in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
As a way of handling it for myself and also finding another audience. And in the past, I've published a YA novel in the past, but that was on a very different subjects. And at some point, I would like to do something with the contents of the blog because there is obviously a huge amount of information of
Mm-hmm.
historical interest in there at this point. One day this will be history. We hope if the world survives the next 4 years, then this time will be history. So I
Right.
will do something with this material.
I'd like to focus in some detail on stories that you have written on Substack. You wrote a number of pieces about the Ukrainian organizations you met in Kramatorsk.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about your time there? Why you were there and what it was like?
Kramatorsk is a city in the east of Ukraine in Donetsk region. Donetsk region is about 70% occupied, but there is still a couple of cities left free. And this city, Kramatorsk, was actually occupied back in 2014 briefly, but it managed to push the invaders out. So it's about 20 kilometers from the front line, I think. It's just out of artillery range, but you can constantly hear the front line booming away, particularly if you live on the east side of town, as I did. And the city is not empty, but it's very quiet. And about 20% of the people there are obviously military in some way, 20% of the vehicles. There's not many children left, but it is still an inhabited, functioning city. There's not much sign of luxury, but the chemists and the food shops are open. You can get a really nice coffee if you know where to go, which is obviously important if you spend a lot of time writing a blog. And there is also a lot of need, sadly, because the closest, the most active front line is the east, which is near Kramatorsk. Everybody will have heard of the city of Pokrovsk, which is being slowly ground down. And Kramatorsk is the nearest big city, so people fleeing from the slow but currently very, very slow but currently inexorable Russian advance flee to Kramatorsk. often with nothing but the clothes they happen to be wearing at the time the Russians burned their house down. So there is a great need there, and there are also a lot of people who are socially disadvantaged and therefore haven't left. For example, elderly people who might normally have been supported by their families. Well, now their son is at the front, their daughter may be at the front as well, or their daughter's gone abroad to protect her kids, or their family have been killed. So there's an awful lot of very old people with no support network, and they rely on local volunteers in some cases and neighbours just to keep them going. So there are some bedridden old people who receive a pension, but they don't receive enough of a pension to pay their utility bills. So the lift in their apartment block doesn't work because nobody's paid for it. And they live on the fifth floor. So even if they're not that debilitated, then they effectively can't go anywhere, or they may be entirely bedridden. So there's incredibly vulnerable people who rely on external support, which is spread extremely thin. So I decided to try and find some of the people who are offering this kind of support and see if I could bring more attention to them from the outside world. Because we don't often hear about Kramatorsk. We hear about Kiev and Lviv and maybe Kharkiv, but Kramatorsk is probably the city where there is the most need for the reasons I've described. So I was able to find some contacts, fortunately, and I met a number of interesting organizations in Kramatorsk, all of which I wrote about. So obviously I recommend people read my Substack. But the primary ones I met were a veterans hub, which obviously supports veterans in various ways. It provides them with help finding new professions, for example, because a lot of people are physically injured or have psychological issues and they can't go back to their old jobs. So they need help with transferring professions, or they're having problems with family as a result of having come back from the combat zone, and they need some kind of psychological support there, or they just need help applying for veterans pensions. So that's a really useful organisation that helps veterans in concrete ways. Unfortunately, they are relatively well supported with funding, but they put me in contact with some even smaller organisations that I was able to write about, and set up with a little bit of support and funding, which was great. So I met the Union of Kramatorsk Volunteers, which is quite a grand name, but it's basically a guy called Bogdan with a knackered car and his mates, and they do an incredible amount of things. They do evacuations almost every day, driving into dangerous places and rescuing people. They run a community taxi. They are first responders if there is a missile strike in their vicinity. They do first aid before the authorities turn up, and they repair people's roofs after they've been hit by drones or missiles. And Bogdan told me they somehow managed to do this on £1,000 a month. So they make a small amount of money going an incredibly long way. And I was able to help them apply for a grant, which was also quite small, but they're using that to buy tools for repairing roofs, which will obviously make their work a bit easier. And the other most interesting organisation I met down there was Dobry Ruch, and that is a community hub just run by a few women who decided they needed to do this at the start of the full-scale invasion. Have been doing it ever since. So it's an office and a hall with piles of random donations in them. I'm sure you've seen that kind of thing. And they just get as many of the basics as they can and hand them out to hundreds and hundreds of people who come and queue up 4 or 5 days a week. And the needs are absolutely fundamental, because these are the people I was talking about who just ran out of their houses with nothing. So, for example, they ran out of their houses in March, and they've got one set of clothes and it's suitable for March, not June. So this place tries to provide them with summer clothes. Or they've been given some really dismal state accommodation because that's all that's available, but they've got absolutely nothing to put in it. So this place will try and give them bedding. And then there's medical and nutritional needs. So one of the biggest things that is needed in community organisations in Ukraine that people don't necessarily realise about is adult nappies. That because I talked about the bedridden people, for example, who really need these, and that's a very big health and obviously dignity issue as well. And those things are really expensive. So I spent some of my own money and donors' money buying a big batch of nappies for Doberu, and I've also tried to put them in contact with an organisation that will be able to supply them on a more long-term basis. I'm hoping that will work out. But they showed me their figures, and they could actually, if they were supplying everyone in Kramatorsk who is in need, they would need £18,000 worth of nappies a month. And that's probably not going to happen, but it gives you an idea of the scale of need. But anything that could be put towards that need is obviously really important. Baby food as well is a big thing they need. And not very many people knew they were there. So I was very pleased to write about them and just give them that coverage that will hopefully lead to something good.
When you talk about funding for these groups and the needs that are there, can you kind of characterize where the funding comes from? Is this government funding? Is this private funders? I mean, can you just say a little bit about that?
Well, there's not much government funding simply because the government is busy trying to cope with the Russian invasion. There's a little bit more state support in the in Ukraine in some ways than there are in Western countries. For example, buildings are centrally heated and you don't pay for that. State support. I haven't met many organisations that have said they have significant state support. I think there is some state support for veterans officially, for example, but it's hit and miss whether you can actually access it. And the state pension is considered to cover everything the elderly people need, but it's some wretched amount. It's about £50 a month for some people, which they can just about feed themselves on that, but there's nothing left over for luxuries like soap, for example. In terms of support from elsewhere, it's always a mix of sources. Ukrainians support themselves more than anybody else does. People say that Ukrainians have been passing the same 10 hryvnia around between themselves for the last 3 years, which is sadly true. Communities try to support themselves, and sometimes there are organisations based in other parts of the country that will be able to funnel some money towards the needier areas. Applying for foreign grants is something that looms large for organisations who know how to do it and have the resources to do it, but that is not everyone. So someone who is running a tiny overflowing storeroom with hundreds of people queuing up at the door just doesn't have the time or the language skills or the knowledge to put in a grant application. And sometimes even if you encourage people to apply for grants, they will do it in the wrong way. They will do something that would be considered inappropriate by the grant awarding body that will rule them out, even though the reason they're doing it is something that looks perfectly rational in Ukraine, but the Western arbiter, for whatever reason, doesn't think it's suitable. So there are a few organisations, Western organisations, that will simply take aid to whoever is needed without this complication, but there's only a few of those. One great one that I spent some time with is Operation Change, who are Swedish, and they just find out places that need stuff, get the stuff, and take it to these places, which is my favourite form of Western aid. You just find out what the Ukrainians need, you give it to them, and then they use it. So Operation Change have been supplying the hub in Kramatorsk with some nappies as well.
One of the stories you wrote about was Marina, a 79-year-old woman who decided to remain in her home in Kherson City during the Russian occupation, and Volodymyr, who looked after 50 children there. Could you tell us a little bit about them?
You might have seen in the news that Kherson City is within drone range now. It was occupied at the start of the full-scale invasion, occupied for 6 months and then deoccupied. But the Russians are still entrenched on the opposite side of the river. So they are within about a kilometre of the city, and they just send out fleets of drones every day to terrorise the local population. So Kherson is increasingly bashed up. And Volodymyr's story is particularly amazing. He ran a children's rehabilitation centre before the full-scale invasion, and of course they woke up one morning and the city was occupied. I think it took 3 days, not one, but essentially that's what happened. And he's got 52 kids to keep safe from the Russian army. So there's footage of him online if you go looking for it. with the Russians charging through the rehabilitation center, making a nuisance of themselves. And somehow he managed to stay out of a Russian torture chamber during that time period. Obviously they declared he was a Nazi and so on, but they didn't actually arrest him or take him away. So he managed to keep these children going by it became a collective effort. Obviously the older children looked after the younger ones, and the children came to understand very quickly that they should play silently in the playground, for example. They shouldn't shout and draw attention to themselves, because on the other side of the wall there would have been Russian patrols. So it was this incredibly difficult 6-month period that he saw them through. And he was a little bit of a media star after that, because it's a really good story. But a couple of years down the line, of course, the media have forgotten him. But what he's trying to do is repair the cellar area so that it's of sufficient standard that children can have lessons and activities down there, and even live down there. So he would like to reopen a kind of children's centre where they can live for 5 days a week and study underground in safety. But he needs 30,000 euros to do that. So if anyone knows of an organisation that supplies large grants, please let us know and we will put him in contact with them. And you also mentioned Marina, who I wrote about. She's just an ordinary resident of Kherson. She lived on the eastern edge of the city, which unfortunately is the area that is most subject to Russian drones. And she told me about her experience there, which is even worse than you see in the media. That far out, nobody goes except the residents. Even the ambulance doesn't drive down there, because the ambulance will get blown up, and that's help anybody. Apparently, there's a guy who repairs the internet cables who goes down there. He just climbs up and down the poles, whatever is going on. But he's the only person who ventures there apart from the locals. And she herself was chased down the street by a drone at one point. And unfortunately, one of her neighbours was recently killed by a drone. And there are a lot of people in a very bad situation there again, because it tends to be elderly people who refuse to leave their homes. And the Russian drone operators particularly like chasing the most vulnerable people that they can find, obviously. So she actually moved out of Kherson 6 months ago, and she's now living with a relative in Mykolaiv. But she was keen to tell me her story, and she's also frustrated about how little news is coming out of Kherson, because this is a horror story and the world should be doing something about it, but we aren't, because we were horrified for 5 minutes and then moved on to the next thing.
Exactly. Another piece is called Village Nurse, about a work done by the Freefilmers NGO, providing medical supplies to deoccupied villages in Ukraine, funded by the UK charity Bear Trust. Now, can you tell us more about that work? And we know the Freefilmers are your good friends. We talked about this the last time you were on the program. Remind us who they are and what is the Bear Trust?
The Freefilmers are a network of independent filmmakers, and they do still make films about Ukraine's life during the war, but they also do humanitarian work as volunteers. Like so many people in Ukraine, they put as much energy as they can to volunteering, supporting the army and civil society in various ways. And of course, they are quite outward facing, so hence being friends with me, for example, because they're a film network, so they were contact with the outside world. So I started joining them on their trips to take humanitarian aid to villages 2 years ago, as I mentioned. And then I looked around for possible organizations for them to apply to for grants. And there weren't many, because one of the many problems with international funding is that the Ukrainian organization is expected to meet all sorts of bureaucratic requirements, which is just not feasible because the Ukrainians are busy trying to survive. But the Bear Trust is a really, really great UK organisation that specialises in making small grants to these small organisations that are doing an incredible amount of good work with the money. So I helped Freefilmers apply to Bear for, I think, 4 or 5 grants so far, for about £1,000 or £2,000 each time. And they're very keen on building resilience, not just supplying immediate needs, though obviously that's important too. So I've been to the occupied villages with the Freefilmers a few times in the past few years and written up what they've done. And they've been to villages in the occupied parts of Mykolaiv region, Kherson region, and Kharkiv region, delivering things like bicycles so the village nurse can get around to the elderly people who can't leave their homes, building equipment so that they can rebuild particularly villages that were fought over for 6 months, almost in ruins, but some people still want to stay there, so you take the rebuilding equipment, medical equipment. What else? Obviously, I'm going blank now that I'm trying to list the things that they've taken, but you get the general idea. Things that will help these places survive tomorrow and rebuild for the day after tomorrow.
Exactly. You also wrote about Natalia Fedorevna, right? The best starosta. Well, what's a starosta, and why did you write about her?
Starosta is a head woman or
Starosta, see that? Okay.
is a head woman or head man of a village.
Mhm.
It's a semi-formal position, I think. It's not quite like a mayor in the Western sense, but she occupies that kind of role. And she was a particularly fascinating example. She was incredibly energetic, in her 50s, I think, but she had a short dyed haircut. She could be wandering around the more alternative areas of central London and not stand out, which is relatively unusual in a small Ukrainian rural village. And she has an enormous collection of toy elephants. 276 of them, it said in the article anyway. She likes elephants a lot, but of course, when her constituents, for want of a better word, though that's not really the right word, discovered that she liked elephants, obviously they started bringing her elephants. So the elephants breed on their own without needing input from her. So the council building has got little caches of elephants all around it, which is great fun.
Ah,
She's if Freefilmers is looking for a village with needs, then they contact the local starosta, and that person will know in detail what village needs, obviously. And she's particularly proactive. She has received some aid from larger organisations, but apparently that's stopped recently. So Freefilmers try to find these places that have the capacity to do something with what's given to them, because that is important. There needs to be a certain degree of organisation to use the kit. But if you've got a proactive starosta, then that person is the point man or woman, and you can be sure that donations will be distributed and used.
great. A final story I'd like to ask you about is one called Tania's House, part of which involves a group of British volunteers repairing village houses destroyed during the war. In this case, the one belonging to Tania. Can you say a little bit about that?
Well, Tania's house is a good snapshot of how things have been developing in the past couple of years. She lives in one of the villages that Freefilmers took aid to, Blahodavne, and that is in the Mykolaiv region, very close to Kherson region, that was liberated after about 6 months of occupation. But the Russians drove down the main street with a tank and obliterated every house as they retreated. So the place is rubble mostly, but there are still a few people there who came back as soon as they could and are rebuilding their houses. And there was an organisation confusingly called BEAR, completely distinct from the Bear Trust, British Expeditionary Aid and Rescue, they called themselves, which is a bit grand, but they just had to think of a name and they came up with that one. And this is actually a couple of guys from Cornwall, farmers, and they just went over to Ukraine. And at first they did some evacuation and general humanitarian work. Then after the occupation, they went and found a village, Blahodavne, which needed rebuilding, and they spent 18 months rebuilding the roofs. So when we turned up in Blahodavne with, I think it was portable stoves on that occasion, we were rather surprised to learn that there were a couple of British guys down the road. So of course we had to go and see the British guys, because I probably hadn't seen another Westerner for a month at that point. And they were repairing the roof of an old lady called Tania. And they said that when they turned up, Tania had been mixing water in a bucket herself. She's in her 60s and presumably not experienced in building or rebuilding houses. But like so many Ukrainians, she was just doing what she could. but they were delighted to have been able to start helping her out. And Tania is obviously a pretty determined person, and she continued helping them. She was doing the ceilings on the inside while they were doing the roofs.
Mhm.
And then we returned a few weeks ago now when we were in that area, and Tania's roof is complete, which is great because Johnny and his team finished building the roofs of the people who are eligible in Blahodatne. And she is starting to fill the house with things she needs and sort out her yard as well. And Tania's house is also the title of a poem that I wrote about Tania's house. So I came second in a competition for this and won £100, which I get taxed on because I'm an author. But money after tax, I thought, well, I'll give this to Tania because she needs it much more than I do. So this time I handed over the cash to her, and she's obviously very pleased. She's going to use it to buy an oven so that she can bake her own bread with, because bread delivery is not reliable at the moment. But it was a great snapshot of someone who had been struggling but working incredibly hard for themselves. And then some meaningful external help did come along, Johnny rebuilding her roof. And now, a couple of years down the line, her house is habitable and she is continuing to rebuild.
And so hearty congratulations on winning second place in the Edward Thomas Fellowship with your poem, the title of which is Tania's House. And it would be wonderful if you could read it to us. Could you do that?
Tania's house. Tania's house will not leave her. Her headscarf blooms as she potters around the garden, checking for mines. The Russians razed the village, home by home by home by home by home, and filmed it. Tania mixes mortar in the dead pig's bucket. The roof sags tenderly over her as she scours the kitchen rubble. Artillery still booms at night as stars drip into the bar. The tabby mouse has survived, and the tray with the daisies. Her best pan, too, only hold through one side. Tania wields patience, veined, meticulous hands rekindling the dented stove. Catch aid workers down here. The days will shorten and winter grasp, and no one forgets the death they didn't die, no matter how hard they prayed. White creases flex on Tania's weathered neck as she bends, mixing mortar in that old bucket, preparing the house, for her son will return.
That's lovely. And it's especially evocative to know that her roof is now repaired, that there is some hope going forward. And I just want to thank you, Anna Bowles. We look forward to reading more of your writing and future blogs on your Substack, and hope for a just and peaceful conclusion in Ukraine.
Thank
Thank you so much.
you very much.